The storm had been building for 3 days, and Helen Lee knew she couldn't walk much further. Each step sent sharp pains through her swollen belly, and the baby inside her it seemed to press against her ribs with every labored breath. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the gray twilight that promised another night without shelter. She clutched the worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the first drops of rain begin to fall. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, she could still hear them. The voices of men who had no right to follow her, no right to claim what wasn't theirs. Her husband's debts had died with him 6 months ago, but his creditors saw things differently. They saw a young widow, barely 22, carrying a child that could be sold to pay what was owed. The thought made her stomach turn, and she pressed her hand protectively over the life growing inside hers. The rain began in earnest now, soaking through her thin dress and making the road slippery beneath her feet. She had been walking since dawn, having slipped away from the boarding house in town before anyone could stop her. The few coins in her pocket wouldn't last long, and she had nowhere to go, no family left to take her in. But she would keep walking until her legs gave out before she'd let them take her baby. A flash of lightning illuminated the landscape ahead, and Helen saw something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. A house sat back from the road, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the storm. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could make out the shapes of a barn and other outbuildings. It looked like a working ranch, the kind of place where honest people might show mercy to a woman in need. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Helen stumbled toward the house, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the yard into a muddy mess that sucked at her shoes with each step. She could barely see through the downpour, but the light from the windows drew her forward like a beacon. When she finally reached the covered porch, she collapsed against the wooden door, her strength completely spent. She raised her hand to knock, but the effort was too much. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself sliding down the doorframe to the rough planks of the porch floor. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her own voice, barely a whisper, calling out for help that might never come. Roy Morgan had been settling in for the evening when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was just the wind rattling something loose on the porch, but then he heard it again. A soft thump, followed by what sounded like a voice. He set down his coffee and walked to the window, peering out into the storm. The rain was coming down so hard he could barely see past the porch rail. He opened the door and stepped outside, immediately soaked by the driving rain. At his feet lay a young woman, unconscious and shivering in the cold. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, and her dress clung to her body, revealing the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. She looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Roy didn't hesitate. He bent down and gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her condition. She stirred slightly as he lifted her, mumbling something he couldn't understand. Her skin was cold and pale, and he could feel her trembling even through her wet clothes. "Easy now," he murmured, though she probably couldn't hear him. "You're safe." He carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind him. The warmth of the house seemed to revive her slightly, and her eyes fluttered open as he set her down on the sofa near the fireplace. She looked around wildly, panic filling her dark eyes as she tried to sit up. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Don't send me back. I can't go back." Roy held up his hands, showing her he meant no harm. "Nobody's sending you anywhere, miss. You're safe here. What's your name?" She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Roy Morgan was a man of 45, weathered by years of ranch work, but with kind eyes and gentle hands. He had lived alone on this spread for the better part of a decade, ever since his wife died in childbirth along with their son. The loss had made him withdraw from the world, but it had also taught him to recognize real suffering when he saw it. "Helen," she finally said. "Helen Lee." "Well, Helen Lee, you look like you could use some dry clothes and a hot meal. Can you tell me what's got you running through a storm in your condition?" Helen's hand moved instinctively to her belly, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "They want to take my baby. They say my husband owed them money, and since he's dead, they have a right to collect however they can. I heard them talking about selling the baby when it's born, finding some wealthy family who can't have children of their own." Roy's jaw tightened. He had heard of such things, though he'd hoped they were just stories meant to frighten young mothers. Who are these men? Do you know their names? Jeremy Cox runs them. He owns the mercantile in town, but everyone knows he has his fingers in other business too, loans and debts and things that aren't quite legal. My husband borrowed money from him to buy seed for our farm, but the crop failed, and then Thomas got sick. Her voice broke. He died owing $300, and Cox says the debt passes to me. Roy knew Jeremy Cox by reputation. The man was a snake who preyed on desperate people, offering loans at impossible terms and then collecting through whatever means necessary. If Cox had decided that Helen's baby was worth $300, he wouldn't give up easily. How long have you been running? Roy asked. 3 days. I've been sleeping in barns and walking the roads, trying to get far enough away that they won't follow. But I think they're still behind me. I heard horses on the road earlier today. Roy walked to the window and peered out into the storm. He couldn't see much through the rain, but something about the darkness felt wrong. There were too many shadows moving in places where shadows shouldn't be. You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death, he said, turning back to Helen. I'll find you something dry to wear, and then we'll figure out what to do about Cox and his men. Helen tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and she sank back onto the sofa. I'm sorry, she said. I don't mean to be a burden. If you could just let me rest here until the storm passes, I'll be on my way. You're not going anywhere in this weather, and certainly not in your condition. When was the last time you ate? Helen had to think about it. Yesterday morning, I think. I found some apples that had fallen from a tree. Roy shook his head. No wonder she could barely stand. He went to his bedroom and found one of his old shirts and a pair of trousers that might fit her if she rolled up the legs. When he returned, Helen was staring into the fire, her hands folded over her belly. The baby's been quiet today, she said softly. Usually he kicks all the time, especially when I'm walking, but today, nothing. Roy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. How far along are you? 7 months, maybe 8. It's hard to tell exactly. Thomas and I were only married a year before he died. She looked up at Roy with frightened eyes. What if something's wrong? What if all this running has hurt the baby? Let's not borrow trouble, Roy said, though he shared her concern. First things first. You need food and rest. The baby will be fine once you take care of yourself. He helped her to the bedroom and left her to change while he went to the kitchen to prepare something she could eat. He had venison stew left over from the day before, and he heated it slowly, adding extra broth to make it easier on her stomach. While it warmed, he made coffee and tried to think through their options. Cox wouldn't give up easily, especially if he thought there was money to be made. The man had connections throughout the territory, and he wouldn't hesitate to use the law to get what he wanted. A widow with no family and no property would have no legal standing against a man like Cox, especially if he claimed she owed him money. But Roy had lived in this territory long enough to know that legal and right weren't always the same thing. He had money saved, enough to pay Helen's debt if it came to that. More importantly, he had a reputation as a man who didn't back down from a fight when the cause was just. Helen emerged from the bedroom wearing his oversized clothes, the shirt hanging loose over her pregnant belly, and the trousers rolled up at the ankles. She looked young and vulnerable, but there was steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Thank you, she said simply, for the clothes, for letting me stay. I know you don't owe me anything. Sit down and eat, Roy said, ladling stew into a bowl. We can talk about what I owe after you get some food in you. Helen ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body remembered what it felt like to be properly nourished. Roy watched her carefully, noting the way she protected her belly even while eating, the way her eyes darted to the windows every time the wind rattled the glass. Tell me about your husband, he said. What kind of man was he? Helen's face softened. Thomas was a good man, a dreamer maybe, but good. He thought we could make a life farming that little plot of land outside town. He worked so hard, from dawn to dusk, trying to make something grow in that stubborn soil. When the drought came and the crops failed, it broke his heart. He blamed himself for not being able to provide for me and the baby. It wasn't his fault the rains didn't come. I told him that, but he wouldn't listen. He got sicker and sicker, and I think part of it was just giving up. When he died, Jeremy Cox was at the funeral talking about how sorry he was for my loss and how he'd work with me to settle Thomas's debts. I was too grief-stricken to understand what he really meant. Roy nodded. He had seen Cox's kind before. Vultures who circled the grieving and desperate, offering help that came with chains attached. What made you finally run? Helen's hand tightened on her spoon. 3 nights ago, Cox came to my room at the boarding house. He had 2 men with him, and he told me he'd been patient long enough. He said I could work off the debt in his establishment, or I could sign papers giving him custody of the baby when it was born. When I refused, he said I didn't really have a choice. That's when I knew I had to get away. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the house and driving the rain against the windows with renewed force. Roy got up and checked the locks on the doors, then pulled the curtains closed over the windows. Something was making him uneasy, a feeling he'd learned to trust during his years of living alone on the frontier. "Helen," he said carefully, "when you were walking today, did you see anyone following you? Riders, maybe, staying back, but keeping you in sight?" She looked up from her bowl, fear creeping back into her eyes. "I thought I saw dust clouds a few times, but with the wind, it was hard to tell." "Wait, Mom." Before Roy could answer, they both heard it. The sound of horses approaching through the storm, their hooves splashing through the mud of the yard. Roy moved quickly to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders sat their horses in front of the house, rain streaming off their hats and coats. Even through the storm, he could see that they were armed. "Helen," he said quietly, "go to the bedroom and stay there. Don't come out no matter what you hear." But Helen was already on her feet, her face white with terror. "It's them," she whispered. "They found me." A loud knock echoed through the house, followed by a voice that carried clearly over the storm. "Roy Morgan, we know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Jeremy Cox. Open up, and we can settle this peaceful like." Roy recognized the voice. Jonathan Adams, one of Cox's enforcers, a man with a reputation for violence and a complete lack of conscience. If Adams was here, it meant Cox was serious about collecting his debt, one way or another. "Stay calm," Roy told Helen, though his own heart was racing. "They can't just break in here and take you. This is still my property, and I still have rights." Helen laughed bitterly. "Rights? What rights does a pregnant widow have against men like these? They'll kill you if you try to protect me, and then they'll take me anyway." The knocking came again, harder this time, and Adams's voice rose with impatience. "We know she's in there, Morgan. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Cox is willing to be reasonable, but his patience has limits." Roy moved to his gun cabinet and took out a rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he'd faced down worse men than Adams in his time. "Helen," he said, "I need you to listen to me carefully. There's a root cellar behind the house, access through a door in the kitchen floor. If things go bad, I want you to get down there and stay hidden until morning. Can you do that?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "What about you?" "I'll handle Adams and his friends, but I need to know you're safe first." Roy showed her the hidden door in the kitchen floor, covered by a rug and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The cellar below was small but dry, stocked with preserved food and blankets. It had been his wife's idea, a place to hide during Indian raids or other troubles. He had never thought he'd need to use it to protect another pregnant woman. "If I don't come for you by dawn," he said, "there's a horse in the barn. Take him and ride east toward the territorial capital. There's a marshal there named Jeffrey Lee, who's an honest man. Tell him what happened, and he'll help you." Helen caught his arm. "Roy, please, just let them take me. I won't have your death on my conscience." "Nobody's dying tonight if I can help it," Roy said. "But I won't stand by and watch them drag you off to whatever fate Cox has planned. Some things are worth fighting for." The knocking had stopped, and Roy could hear voices outside, low and urgent. Adams was talking to his companions, probably planning their next move. Roy knew they wouldn't wait much longer before trying more direct methods. "Get down there," he told Helen, "and whatever happens, don't come out until it's safe." Helen hesitated for a moment, then stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Roy watched her disappear into the cellar, then replaced the rug over the door. He checked his rifle one more time and moved to the front window. The three riders were still there, but now they had dismounted and were approaching the house on foot. Adams carried a shotgun, and the other two had their hands on their pistols. Roy opened the front door just wide enough to show himself, keeping the rifle ready, but not obviously threatening. "Adams," he said, "what brings you out in this weather?" Jonathan Adams was a lean man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. He had worked for Jeremy Cox for 5 years, and in that time, he had developed a reputation for getting results, regardless of the methods required. "You know why we're here, Morgan. The woman you are harboring belongs to Mr. Cox. She owes him money, and he intends to collect." "I don't know what you're talking about," and Roy said. "I'm here alone, same as always." Adams smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We track her here, Morgan. Her footprints lead right to your door, and they don't lead away. Now we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. Your choice. Even if there was a woman here, which there isn't, what gives Cox the right to drag her off in the middle of the night?" "She signed papers," Adams said. "Legal documents that give Mr. Cox certain rights in the matter of her husband's debts. If she's violated the terms of those agreements, that's a matter for the law." Roy knew it was a lie. Helen had been clear that she'd never signed anything. And even if she had, no court in the territory would uphold a contract that essentially sold a woman and her unborn child into bondage. But Adams wasn't interested in legal niceties. "I think you boys better get back on your horses and ride out," Roy said, "before this storm gets any worse." Adams' smile faded. "Step aside, Morgan. We're coming in to look around, and if you try to stop us, you'll regret it." "This is my property," Roy said, raising the rifle slightly, "and you're not welcome on it." The tension stretched between them, thick as the storm clouds overhead. Roy could see Adams calculating, weighing the risks of a gunfight against the value of completing his mission. The two men with him looked nervous, glancing between their leader and the armed rancher blocking their way. Then Adams made his decision. He raised his shotgun, and Roy knew there would be no more talking. "Last chance, Morgan. Stand aside or we'll go through you." Roy's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he'd meant what he said to Helen. Some things were worth fighting for, and protecting an innocent woman and her unborn child was definitely one of them. "Then I guess we understand each other," Roy said. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the scene in stark black and white. Three armed men faced one, with a pregnant woman's life hanging in the balance. Roy thought of Helen hiding in the cellar below, probably listening to every word and knowing that her fate was being decided above her head. Adams took a step forward, his shotgun leveled at Roy's chest. "You're making a mistake, Morgan. Cox has friends in high places. Even if you kill us, more will come. The woman will never be safe." "Maybe not," Roy said, "but she'll be safe tonight." The standoff stretched into long seconds, each man waiting for the other to make the first move. Roy could feel his heart pounding, but his hands were steady on the rifle. He had been in situations like this before, during his younger days when the territory was wilder and justice often came at the end of a gun. Adams seemed to sense his resolve, and something shifted in the man's cold eyes. Perhaps he was remembering stories he'd heard about Roy Morgan, tales of a man who had faced down claim jumpers and rustlers in the early days of his ranch. Or maybe he was simply calculating whether Helen Lee was worth dying for. "This isn't over," Adams said finally, lowering his shotgun slightly. "Cox won't forget this, and neither will I." "I'm counting on it," Roy replied. "Now get off my land." Adams jerked his head toward his companions, and the three men backed slowly toward their horses. But Roy could see in their faces that this was only a temporary retreat. They would be back, probably with more men and a different plan. As the riders disappeared into the storm, Roy remained at the door for several minutes, watching and listening. The rain was beginning to ease slightly, but the wind still howled around the house. He could feel the temperature dropping, and he knew the fall storm would likely continue through the night. Finally, he closed and barred the door, then went to the kitchen to let Helen out of the cellar. She emerged pale and shaking, having heard every word of the confrontation above. "They'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Roy agreed, but not tonight. The storm will keep them away until morning, and by then we'll have figured out our next move. Helen sank into a chair, her hands pressed against her belly. There is no next move, she said. Cox has men everywhere, and he has money to buy more. Even if we run, he'll find us eventually. Roy poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. Tell me about these papers Adams mentioned. Did you sign anything? Nothing, Helen said firmly. When Thomas died, Cox came to me with documents, but I refused to sign them. I couldn't read all the legal language, but I understood enough to know they weren't in my favor. Then Adams was lying, which means Cox doesn't have any legal claim on you or your baby. That's something at least. Helen looked at him with desperate eyes. It doesn't matter what's legal if he has enough men with guns. You saw what just happened. They were ready to kill you just to get to me. Roy nodded. She was right, of course. In a territory where the nearest law might be days away, legal rights often mattered less than firepower and determination. But he had faced worse odds and survived. Helen, he said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How much do you trust me? She looked surprised by the question. You saved my life tonight. You risked your own life to protect me and my baby. Why would you ask that? Because what I'm about to propose will require complete trust between us. If you have any doubts about my intentions or my ability to keep you safe, now is the time to say so. Helen studied his face for a long moment. Roy Morgan was not a handsome man by conventional standards, but there was something solid and dependable about him that reminded her of her father. His eyes were honest, and his hands, though scarred by years of hard work, had been gentle when he carried her inside. I trust you, she said simply. Roy nodded. Then here's what we're going to do. Cox thinks he can intimidate me into giving you up, but he's miscalculated. I have resources he doesn't know about, and I have friends who owe me favors. More importantly, I have something he wants more than your baby. What's that? Information. Cox isn't just a moneylender, Helen. He's been using his business as a front for other activities. Smuggling mostly, but also some things that would interest the territorial government. I've been watching him for months, gathering evidence. Helen's eyes widened. You're some kind of lawman? Not exactly, Roy said, but I have connections to people who are. The point is, Cox has more to lose than he realizes. If he pushes this too far, he might find himself facing charges that would put him in prison for a very long time. But what about tonight? What about Adams and his men? Roy stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The storm was definitely weakening, and he could see his stars beginning to appear between the clouds. Tonight we wait, he said, and we prepare. By morning, I'll have sent word to people who can help us. But first, you need to get some rest. You've been through enough for one day. Helen wanted to protest, to say that she couldn't possibly sleep with Cox's men somewhere out there in the darkness. But exhaustion was weighing heavily on her, and she could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, responding to her stress and fatigue. What about you? She asked. You can't stay awake all night watching for them. I've done it before, Roy said. Besides, they won't try anything else tonight. Adams is smart enough to know that a direct assault on a fortified position is a losing proposition. He'll wait for daylight and try to find another way. Roy helped Helen back to the bedroom, making sure she had everything she needed. As she settled under the blankets, she caught his hand. Roy, she said, why are you doing this? You don't know me, and this isn't your fight. Roy was quiet for a moment, and Helen could see old pain flickering in his eyes. My wife died in childbirth 10 years ago, he said finally. She was about your age, scared and alone when the labor started because I was away on business. If there had been someone there to help her, to protect her, maybe things would have been different. Helen squeezed his hand. I'm sorry. So am I, Roy said, but maybe this is a chance to make up for not being there when she needed me. After Helen fell asleep, Roy made his preparations. He loaded all his weapons and placed them strategically around the house. He wrote several letters, including one to Marshal Jeffrey Lee in the territorial capital, and another to a friend who worked for the territorial government's investigation division. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record of what Cox was trying to do. As dawn approached, Roy stood at the kitchen window, watching the yard for signs of movement. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Birds were beginning to sing in the trees around the house, and the first rays of sunlight were painting the eastern sky golden pink. It was then that he saw them. Not Adams and his two companions, but a much larger group, at least 8 men on horseback, positioned at strategic points around his property. They weren't trying to hide their presence. In fact, they seemed to want him to see them. Roy cursed under his breath. Cox had called in reinforcements, probably every gun he could hire in the territory. This wasn't going to be a simple standoff anymore. This was going to be a siege. A white flag appeared among the riders, and Roy saw a familiar figure riding toward the house. Jeremy Cox himself, dressed in his finest suit despite the early hour, his round face wearing an expression of false concern. Roy opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. Cox rode up to within speaking distance and stopped, his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Morgan?" Cox called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Roy studied Jeremy Cox's face, noting the calculated smile that never reached the man's eyes. Behind Cox, the 8 riders remained motionless, their weapons visible but not drawn. It was a show of force designed to intimidate, but Roy had faced worse odds in his younger days. "Mr. Cox," Roy called back, keeping his voice level, "you're trespassing on private property. State your business or move along." Cox dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He was a soft man, Roy noticed, someone who relied on others to do his violence for him. But that made him no less dangerous, perhaps more so. "Now, Roy, there's no need for hostility between neighbors. I'm here about a simple business matter, a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand." Cox approached the porch with his hands visible, though his men remained ready. "You're harboring a woman who owes me a considerable sum of money. I'm prepared to be reasonable about collecting what's owed. I told your man Adams last night, there's no woman here." Cox's smile widened, becoming even less genuine. "Come now, Roy. We both know that's not true. Helen Lee came to you seeking shelter, and being the good Samaritan you are, you took her in. I admire that quality in a man, truly I do. But business is business." Roy shifted his grip on the rifle, noting how Cox's eyes tracked the movement. The man was afraid despite his show of confidence. That was useful information. "Even if what you're saying were true, what gives you the right to come onto my land with armed men?" "Legal documents," Cox said, reaching slowly into his coat. He withdrew a folded paper and held it up. "Mrs. Lee's late husband signed agreements that make me the beneficiary of certain collateral in the event of default. The woman and her child fall under those terms." Roy knew it was a forgery, but Cox was counting on the fact that most people in the territory couldn't read well enough to challenge legal documents. It was a common trick among men of his type. "I'd like to see those papers," Roy said. Cox's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid that's not possible. These are confidential business documents. But I assure you they're perfectly legal and properly witnessed." From inside the house, Roy heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Helen crying out, not in fear but in pain. The kind of pain that meant only one thing. Cox heard it too, and his expression changed to one of predatory satisfaction. "It sounds like Mrs. Lee is in some distress. Perhaps we should check on her condition." Roy's mind raced. If Helen was going into labor, everything changed. She would need help, medical attention that he couldn't provide alone. And Cox knew it, had probably been counting on exactly this development. "She's fine," Roy said, though another cry from inside the house made the lie obvious. "Roy, be reasonable. The woman is about to give birth, possibly in difficult circumstances. I have a doctor with me, a man trained in these matters. Let us help her, and we can settle our business afterward like civilized men." Roy glanced toward the riders and spotted a man in a dark suit carrying what looked like a medical bag. But he also noticed the way the others were positioned, forming a loose circle around the house. If he let them inside, he'd never get them out again. Another cry echoed from the bedroom, longer this time and filled with genuine distress. Roy felt his resolve wavering. Whatever his feelings about Cox and his methods, Helen and her baby needed medical attention. Your doctor can examine her, Roy said finally, but only him and only with me present. The rest of your men stay outside. Cox nodded eagerly. Of course, of course. Dr. Roy Jackson is a professional man, completely trustworthy. He'll take excellent care of Mrs. Lee. Roy noticed the way Cox emphasized the doctor's name, as if it should mean something to him. Roy Jackson. The name was familiar, but he couldn't place it immediately. The doctor dismounted and approached the house, his medical bag in one hand and the other raised to show he was unarmed. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and nervous eyes that darted constantly between Roy and Cox. Mr. Morgan, the doctor said as he reached the porch, I'm Dr. Jackson. I understand there is a woman in labor who needs assistance. Roy studied the man's face, trying to read his intentions. There was something about his manner that seemed genuinely concerned, less calculating than Cox's obvious manipulation. She's inside, Roy said, stepping back to allow the doctor entry but keeping his rifle ready. But understand this, doctor. Any harm comes to that woman or her child, and you'll answer to me personally. Dr. Jackson nodded gravely. I took an oath to do no harm, Mr. Morgan. I intend to honor that oath regardless of the circumstances that brought me here. Roy led the doctor to the bedroom where Helen lay curled on her side, her face pale and streaked with sweat. She looked up as they entered, fear and pain warring in her dark eyes. Helen, Roy said gently, this is Dr. Jackson. He's here to help you. Helen's gaze shifted to the doctor, and Roy saw recognition flicker across her features. I know you, she whispered. You treated my husband before he died. Dr. Jackson's expression grew pained. Yes, Mrs. Lee, I remember. I'm sorry I couldn't do more for Thomas. What are you doing with Cox? Helen asked, her voice tight with another contraction. The doctor set down his bag and began washing his hands in the basin Roy provided. Mr. Cox came to me this morning, said there was a woman in difficult labor who needed immediate attention. As a doctor, I couldn't refuse. Roy watched the interaction carefully, noting the genuine remorse in Jackson's voice when he spoke of Helen's husband. Whatever the doctor's connection to Cox, it seemed reluctant rather than willing. How far apart are the contractions? Dr. Jackson asked, moving to examine Helen. They started about an hour ago, Helen gasped. They're getting stronger. The doctor's examination was thorough and professional, his manner gentle despite the circumstances. When he finished, his expression was troubled. Mrs. Lee, he said carefully, the baby is in a difficult position, what we call a breech presentation. The birth will be complicated, and there are risks involved. Helen gripped Roy's hand with surprising strength. What kind of risks? For both you and the child, Jackson admitted. I can manage the delivery, but it will require time and careful attention. And there's always the possibility of complications that would require surgery. From outside, Cox's voice called impatiently. Doctor, how is our patient? Dr. Jackson glanced toward the window, then back at Helen. Mr. Morgan, I need to speak with you privately. Roy followed the doctor to the kitchen, leaving Helen to rest between contractions. Jackson's nervous demeanor had intensified, and he kept glancing toward the front door. Mr. Morgan, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. Jeremy Cox didn't just ask me to come here as a doctor. He has certain expectations about the outcome of this birth. Roy felt cold dread settling in his stomach. What kind of expectations? He believes that if complications arise during delivery, if choices have to be made about who to save, that those choices should favor his business interests rather than medical ethics. The full scope of Cox's plan became clear to Roy in that moment. The man wasn't just trying to collect a debt. He was positioning himself to claim Helen's child regardless of what happened to her. If she died in childbirth, he could claim custody of the baby as collateral. If she survived, he'd still have leverage to force her compliance. Doctor, Roy said carefully, what do you intend to do? Jackson met his eyes directly for the first time. I intend to save both mother and child if it's humanly possible. But I need your help to do it. What kind of help? Cox expects me to report regularly on Mrs. Lee's condition. If I tell him the birth is proceeding normally, he'll wait. But if he thinks there are complications, he'll want to intervene directly. I need time to work without interference. Another cry from the bedroom interrupted their conversation. Helen was calling for Roy, her voice strained with pain and fear. We'll discuss this later, Roy said. Right now, that woman needs help. They returned to find Helen in the grip of a powerful contraction, her hands clutching the bedsheets as waves of pain washed over her. Dr. Jackson immediately took charge, his professional demeanor replacing his earlier nervousness. Mrs. Lee, I need you to listen to me carefully. This birth is going to take time, and it's going to be difficult. But I've delivered breech babies before, and with patience and care, both you and your child can come through this safely. Helen nodded, tears streaming down her face. Just save my baby, she whispered. Whatever happens to me, save my baby. I'm going to save both of you, Jackson said firmly, but I need you to trust me and follow my instructions exactly. Over the next several hours, Roy found himself thrust into the role of medical assistant, following Dr. Jackson's instructions to help with the delivery. The doctor proved to be skilled and dedicated, working tirelessly to manage the complicated birth while keeping Helen as comfortable as possible. Outside, Cox grew increasingly impatient. Every hour or so, he would call out demanding updates, and Dr. Jackson would step onto the porch to provide carefully edited reports. The birth was proceeding, he would say, but these things took time. Cox would accept these explanations with obvious frustration, but his men remained in position around the house. As the afternoon wore on, Helen's labor intensified. The baby was indeed in a breech position, and Dr. Jackson had to work carefully to avoid injury to both mother and child. Roy found himself admiring the man's skill and dedication, wondering how someone of his obvious integrity had become involved with Jeremy Cox. During a brief respite between contractions, Roy asked the question that had been bothering him. Doctor, how did Cox get his hooks into you? Jackson glanced toward Helen, who was dozing fitfully, then back at Roy. My daughter, he said quietly. She borrowed money from Cox to pay for her husband's medical treatments. When her husband died anyway, she couldn't repay the loan. Cox offered to forgive the debt in exchange for certain professional services. Roy nodded grimly. It was the same pattern Cox used with all his victims, finding their weaknesses and exploiting them ruthlessly. What happens when this is over? Roy asked. Cox isn't going to just walk away. I don't know, Jackson admitted. I've been hoping to find a way out of this arrangement, but Cox has made it clear that any betrayal would result in serious consequences for my daughter. Another contraction gripped Helen, stronger than the previous ones, and both men turned their attention back to the immediate crisis. The baby was beginning to crown, but the position was still problematic. This is it, Dr. Jackson said. Mrs. Lee, I need you to push, but gently. We have to be very careful here. What followed was the most intense hour of Roy's life. Under Dr. Jackson's expert guidance, Helen fought through the final stages of labor, her courage and determination evident despite her exhaustion and pain. Roy held her hand, offering what comfort he could while marveling at her strength. Finally, with a last tremendous effort, Helen delivered her child. Dr. Jackson caught the baby expertly, immediately checking for signs of life. For a terrifying moment, the infant was silent and still. Then a lusty cry filled the room, and Roy felt tears he didn't know he was shedding run down his cheeks. It's a boy, Dr. Jackson announced, his own voice thick with emotion. A healthy, beautiful boy. Helen collapsed back onto the pillows, exhausted but radiant with joy. Is he really all right? She whispered. He's perfect, Jackson assured her, cleaning the baby and wrapping him in a soft blanket before placing him in his mother's arms. Roy watched the scene with a mixture of joy and dread. The birth had been successful, but Cox was still waiting outside with his armed men. The real crisis was just beginning. As if summoned by his thoughts, Cox's voice called from the yard. Doctor, it's been quiet in there for some time. I trust everything has concluded satisfactorily. Dr. Jackson looked at Roy, then at Helen and her newborn son. What do I tell him? The truth, Helen said quietly. It won't matter what you say. He's going to try to take my baby regardless. Roy moved to the window and peered out through the curtains. Cox's men had moved closer to the house during the afternoon, and he could see more riders approaching from the direction of town. The man was bringing in reinforcements, preparing for whatever resistance Roy might offer. "Doctor," Roy said, "is Helen strong enough to travel?" Jackson examined his patient carefully. "Not for several days at minimum. The birth was difficult and she needs time to recover. Moving her now could cause serious complications." "Then we make our stand here," Roy said grimly. Helen looked up from her baby with fierce determination in her eyes. "No, I won't have you killed defending us. There has to be another way." "What other way?" Roy asked. "Cox has us surrounded and he's not going to negotiate." Dr. Jackson cleared his throat nervously. "There might be an alternative. Mr. Morgan, you mentioned earlier that you had information about Cox's other activities." "What kind of information?" Roy studied the doctor's face, trying to gauge his trustworthiness. "Why do you want to know?" "Because if Cox were to face legal troubles, serious ones, it might provide leverage to negotiate Helen's freedom. My daughter's freedom as well." "You're talking about betraying the man who holds your daughter's debt." "I'm talking about doing what's right," Jackson said firmly. "I became a doctor to help people, not to enable men like Jeremy Cox. If there's a way to stop him, I want to help." Roy made his decision. Cox has been using his mercantile business to smuggle goods across the territorial border. Weapons, mostly, but also gold and silver that should be going to the territorial treasury. I've been documenting his activities for months, gathering evidence. Evidence that would interest the territorial authorities. Evidence that would put him in prison for 20 years, assuming it reached the right people. Dr. Jackson nodded slowly. "Then we need to get that evidence to Marshal Jeffrey Lee in the territorial capital." "That's easier said than done with Cox's men surrounding the house." Helen had been listening to their conversation while nursing her baby. Now she spoke up, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "There's a way," she said. "Cox doesn't know about the root cellar, does he? The entrance Roy showed me last night?" Roy shook his head. "It's well hidden. Even if they search the house, they might not find it." "Then someone could get out that way, travel to town, and send word to the marshal." "It would have to be me," Dr. Jackson said. "Cox expects me to leave eventually, and my absence wouldn't be immediately suspicious." Roy considered the plan. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. How long would it take to get word to Marshal Lee? "If I ride hard, I could reach the telegraph office in town within 2 hours. A message to the territorial capital would arrive by morning, and the marshal could be here by tomorrow evening with enough men to arrest Cox and his entire operation. That's assuming Cox doesn't decide to move against us before then." Helen looked down at her sleeping baby, then back at Roy with steel in her eyes. "Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't." Roy spent the next hour preparing for what might be a siege. He moved all his ammunition to strategic positions around the house and made sure the water barrels were full. Helen, despite her recent ordeal, insisted on helping where she could, her maternal instincts having transformed her from a frightened refugee into a determined protector. Dr. Jackson prepared to leave, but first he had to make one more report to Cox. The three of them agreed on a story. The birth had been successful, but Helen was weak and needed extended rest. Jackson would return to town to gather additional medical supplies, then come back to monitor her recovery. "Remember," Roy told the doctor as he prepared to leave through the root cellar, "once you send that telegram, there's no going back. Cox will know you've betrayed him." "My daughter will understand," Jackson said. "She never wanted me to get involved with Cox in the first place. This is my chance to make things right." Jackson emerged from the cellar in the barn, where his horse was waiting. To anyone watching, it would appear that he had simply retrieved his medical bag and was preparing to leave. He mounted his horse and rode over to where Cox waited. "How is our patient, doctor?" Cox asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "The birth was successful," Jackson reported. "A healthy boy, but Mrs. Lee is exhausted and needs rest. I'm returning to town for additional supplies and will check on her again tomorrow." Cox nodded, apparently satisfied. "Excellent. And the child is healthy, you say?" "Very healthy. Strong lungs, good color, normal weight." "Splendid." Cox's smile was predatory. "I'll want to see the child myself, of course, but that can wait until Mrs. Lee has recovered sufficiently." Jackson mounted his horse and rode away, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to do. Behind him, Cox turned his attention back to the house where Roy and Helen waited. "Mr. Morgan," Cox called out, "I think it's time we had that civilized discussion I mentioned earlier." Roy appeared on the porch, his rifle still in hand. "I'm listening." "The child has been born safely, which simplifies our situation considerably. Mrs. Lee's debt to me is now represented by tangible collateral. I'm prepared to be generous in my terms." "What kind of terms?" Cox dismounted and approached the porch, his hands visible, but his men ready behind him. "Mrs. Lee can keep her child for now, raise him until he's old enough to be useful. In exchange, she'll work for me, helping to manage certain aspects of my business. It's a fair arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Roy felt sick at the implications. Cox was offering to turn Helen into an indentured servant, using her child as leverage to ensure her compliance. "And if she refuses, then I'll be forced to exercise my legal rights as a creditor. The child will be placed with a family that can properly provide for him, and Mrs. Lee will face the consequences of defaulting on a legal debt." From inside the house, Helen's voice called out clearly, "I can hear you, Mr. Cox, and my answer is no." Cox's pleasant facade slipped slightly. "Mrs. Lee, you're not thinking clearly. You've just given birth, and you're probably not considering all the implications of your situation. Perhaps you should take some time to think it over." "I don't need time," Helen replied. "I'll never agree to your terms." Cox's smile disappeared entirely. "Then I'm afraid we'll have to resolve this matter through other means. Mr. Morgan, you've been harboring a woman who owes me money and refusing to honor legal documents. That makes you an accessory to theft. Those documents are forgeries, and you know it." "Prove it in court," Cox sneered, "assuming you live long enough to see a courtroom." The threat was open now, no longer disguised as civilized negotiation. Roy tightened his grip on his rifle, calculating distances and angles. Cox's men had moved closer during the conversation, and he was now effectively surrounded. "You're making a mistake, Cox. There are people who know I'm here. People who'll come looking if I just don't show up in town." "Are there?" Cox asked mockingly. "You live alone, Morgan. You have no family, few friends, and fewer people who would miss you if you simply disappeared. An unfortunate accident during a storm, perhaps. These things happen on isolated ranches." Roy realized that Cox had done his research, knew exactly how vulnerable he was. But the man had made one crucial error. He didn't know about the evidence Roy had gathered, or about Dr. Jackson's mission to the territorial capital. "Last chance, Morgan. Send the woman and child out, and you can walk away from this. Continue to interfere, and you'll face the consequences." Roy looked back at the house where Helen waited with her newborn son, then at the armed men surrounding his property. The odds were impossible, but some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. "Come and take them," Roy said quietly. Cox's face flushed with anger. "You're a fool, Morgan." "Jonathan!" Adams stepped forward, his shotgun ready. "Yes, sir." "Mr. Morgan has made his choice. Proceed accordingly." Adams nodded and began signaling to the other men. Roy realized he had perhaps minutes before they launched their assault. He backed toward the door, keeping his rifle trained on Cox. "Helen," he called out, "get ready. They're coming." But as Roy reached the door, he heard something that made him pause. The sound of horses approaching at a gallop, coming fast from the direction of town. Cox heard it too, his head turning toward the sound with a frown of confusion. "Who the hell is that?" Adams muttered. The riders came into view moments later, and Roy felt a surge of hope. Marshal Jeffrey Lee rode at the head of a group of 6 armed deputies, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Dr. Jackson rode beside the marshal, his face grim but determined. Cox's men looked to their leader uncertainly. They had signed on to intimidate a lone rancher, not to fight a pitched battle with territorial law enforcement. Marshal Lee reined in his horse just outside the circle of Cox's men, his hand resting on his pistol. He was a tall man with gray hair and hard eyes, someone who had spent decades enforcing law in a territory where justice often came at gunpoint. "Jeremy Cox," the marshal called out, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "You and your men are under arrest." Cox's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "On what charges?" smuggling, tax evasion, extortion, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Dr. Jackson has provided us with very interesting information about your business practices. Cox spun to stare at the doctor, who met his gaze steadily. You betrayed me, Cox snarled, after everything I've done for you. You mean after everything you have forced me to do, Jackson replied. My daughter is free of her debt, Cox. The territorial government has agreed to forgive it in exchange for my testimony against you. Roy stepped off the porch, his rifle still ready, but no longer the primary line of defense. Marshal Lee, there's a woman inside who's just given birth. She needs protection from this man and his associates. She'll have it, the marshal promised. Cox, order your men to lay down their weapons. For a moment, it seemed Cox might order his men to fight. His face was twisted with rage, and Roy could see him calculating the odds. But even Cox wasn't foolish enough to start a war with territorial law enforcement. Do as he says, Cox said finally, his voice bitter with defeat. One by one, Cox's men dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Marshal Lee's deputies moved efficiently to secure the prisoners, though Roy noticed that several of Cox's hired guns seemed almost relieved to be taken into custody. Morgan, Marshal Lee said, Dr. Jackson tells me you have evidence that will help our case against Cox. I do, Roy confirmed. Documentation of his smuggling operations, records of illegal transactions, correspondence with his contacts across the border. Enough to put him away for a very long time. Cox glared at Roy with pure hatred. This isn't over, Morgan. I have friends, connections. You'll regret interfering in my business. The only thing I regret, Roy said, is not stopping you sooner. As the prisoners were loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial capital, Dr. Jackson approached Roy. How is Mrs. Lee? He asked. Strong, Roy replied. Stronger than any of us realized. And the baby? Healthy and beautiful. Would you like to see him? Jackson nodded and Roy led him back into the house. Helen was sitting up in bed, nursing her son, her face peaceful for the first time since Roy had known her. Dr. Jackson, she said, looking up as they entered. Thank you for everything. I should be thanking you, Jackson replied. Your courage gave me the strength to do what I should have done months ago. Helen looked down at her baby, then back at the two men who had risked everything to protect her. What happens now? Now you rest, Roy said. And when you're strong enough, we'll figure out what comes next. Cox's property will be seized by the territorial government, Marshal Lee said, having entered behind them. That includes any debts he claimed were owed to him. Mrs. Lee, you are free of any obligation to that man. Helen's eyes filled with tears of relief. Free, she whispered, as if testing the word. Free, Roy confirmed. You and your son, both. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Roy stood on his porch watching the last of Cox's men being led away. The crisis was over, but he knew that Helen's real journey was just beginning. She was free, but freedom came with its own challenges. Behind him, he could hear Helen singing softly to her baby, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago. It was a sound of hope, of new beginnings, of a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was hope. And in the bedroom of a ranch house on the frontier, a young mother held her son close and whispered promises of the life they would build together, free from the shadows of the past and ready to face whatever the future might bring. The weeks that followed Cox's arrest brought a peace to the ranch that Roy had not known in years. Helen recovered slowly but steadily, her strength returning with each passing day. The baby, whom she had named Thomas after his father, buzzed under her devoted care and Roy's quiet protection. But as Helen's physical healing progressed, Roy began to notice something troubling in her eyes, a restlessness that spoke of deeper wounds than those left by childbirth. She would stand at the kitchen window for long periods, watching the horizon as if expecting some new threat to emerge from the distant hills. When Roy spoke to her, she would startle, her hand instinctively moving to protect the baby at her breast. At night, he could hear her pacing the floor of the bedroom, murmuring soft reassurances to little Thomas, even when the child slept peacefully. Dr. Jackson visited regularly, ostensibly to check on Helen's recovery, but increasingly to escape his own demons. The doctor's betrayal of Cox had freed his daughter from debt, but it had also made him a marked man among certain circles in town. He found solace in the quiet routine of the ranch, helping Roy with small tasks and sharing meals that reminded all three adults of what family might feel like. "She's healing well physically," Jackson confided to Roy one evening as they sat on the porch while Helen bathed the baby inside. "But there are wounds that go deeper than flesh. What she endured before coming here, the fear and desperation, those things leave scars that take longer to heal." Roy nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. His own scars from losing his wife and child had never fully healed, only scabbed over with solitude and hard work. But Helen's presence in his house had begun to stir something he thought had died with his family, a longing for connection that both thrilled and terrified him. "What does she need?" Roy asked. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Purpose," he said finally. "Security, yes, but more than that. She needs to know that her life and her child's life have meaning beyond mere survival." The answer came sooner than either man expected. 3 days later, a wagon appeared on the road to the ranch, driven by a woman Roy recognized as Donna Thomas, the wife of the territorial judge. Beside her sat two other women, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear that Roy had learned to recognize in Helen's features weeks earlier. Donna Thomas was a formidable woman in her 50s, known throughout the territory for her work with displaced families and women in desperate circumstances. She had founded what she called the Women's Aid Society, a network of safe houses and supportive families that helped women escape abusive situations or start new lives after tragedy. "Mr. Morgan," Donna called out as she brought the wagon to a stop in the yard. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but Dr. Jackson suggested you might be willing to help with a delicate situation." Roy stepped off the porch, his eyes taking in the two women who sat huddled in the wagon bed. One appeared to be in her 30s, her dark hair streaked with premature gray, and her clothes was bearing the signs of hard travel. The other was younger, perhaps 19, and clearly pregnant despite her attempts to hide her condition beneath a worn shawl. "What kind of help are you looking for, Mrs. Thomas?" "These women need sanctuary, Mr. Morgan. Judith Gomez here fled from a husband who beat her nearly to death. Deborah Peterson is carrying a child whose father refuses to acknowledge paternity and has threatened violence if she doesn't disappear. They need somewhere safe to stay while we arrange more permanent solutions." Roy glanced toward the house where Helen had appeared in the doorway with baby Thomas in her arms. Her face showed no surprise at the arrival of these desperate women, only a recognition that seemed to run deeper than mere sympathy. "How did Dr. Jackson know to send you here?" Roy asked. Donna Thomas smiled. "The good doctor seems to think that your ranch has become something of a refuge for women in need. He mentioned that you've already provided sanctuary to someone in similar circumstances." Helen stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion Roy could see in her eyes. "They can stay," she said. "We have room, and they need help." Roy looked at Helen with surprise. In the weeks since Cox's arrest, she had barely spoken about her own ordeal, much less expressed interest in helping others. But something in her posture had changed, a straightening of her shoulders that spoke of newfound resolve. "Mrs. Thomas," Helen continued, "I know what it's like to run with nowhere to go. If Mr. Morgan is willing, I'd like to help these women however I can." Roy felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that Helen was no longer the frightened refugee who had collapsed on his porch. The woman standing before him had found strength in her own survival and was ready to use that strength to help others. "They can stay as long as they need to," Roy said. "We'll make room." Over the following hours, Roy watched Helen transform before his eyes. She took charge of settling the two women, preparing food and finding clean clothes while offering the kind of quiet comfort that could only come from someone who had walked a similar path. Judith Gomez, the older woman, had been beaten so severely that she could barely walk, but Helen's gentle care and understanding seemed to ease some of her physical and emotional pain. Deborah Peterson, the pregnant teenager, was closer to Helen's own age and situation, and the two women formed an immediate bond. Helen shared her own story in careful increments, revealing enough to establish trust while protecting the most painful details. Roy found himself moved by Helen's instinctive understanding of what these women needed, not just physical shelter, but emotional sanctuary as well. She's found her calling. Jackson observed that evening as they watched Helen helping Deborah with some mending while Judith rocked baby Thomas by the fire. This is what she was meant to do. Roy nodded, though he felt a complex mixture of pride and apprehension. Helen's newfound purpose was beautiful to witness, but it also meant that his quiet ranch was about to become something very different. The solitary life he had built since his wife's death was ending, replaced by something larger and more complicated. That night, after the household had settled into sleep, Roy found Helen sitting on the porch with Thomas in her arms. The baby was fussing quietly, and she was humming the same lullaby he had heard her sing on the night of his birth. "You don't have to do this," Roy said, settling into the chair beside her. "Taking on other people's troubles, I mean. You've been through enough of your own." Helen looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 22 years. "When I was running from Cox, I felt so alone. Even when you took me in, part of me wondered if it was real, if someone could actually care about a stranger's welfare without expecting something in return. But you did care, and Dr. Jackson did, and even Marshall Lee risked his career to help me." She paused, adjusting the baby's blanket as a cool breeze swept across the porch. "Today, when I saw Judith's bruises and Deborah's fear, I recognized something I never want to feel again. That hopelessness, that certainty that the world is full of people who will hurt you and no one who will help. If I can be for them what you were for me, then maybe some good can come from all the pain." Roy felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Helen, what you're talking about, it's not just helping a few women. If word gets out that this ranch is a safe place, more will come. Dozens, maybe hundreds over time. It would change everything." "I know," Helen said simply, "and I know it's your ranch, your decision. But Roy, I think this is what I'm supposed to do with my life, what Thomas and I are supposed to do." Roy looked out at the vast expanse of his property, land that had felt empty and purposeless since his wife's death. He thought about the long, solitary years he had spent here, working the ranch but never really living. Then he looked at Helen, holding her son with such fierce protectiveness, and realized that she was offering him something he had never dared to hope for, a chance to be part of something meaningful again. "We'll need more buildings," he said finally. "Proper accommodations for families, maybe a small clinic where Dr. Jackson can provide medical care. And we'll need help, people we can trust to assist with the work." Helen's face lit up with joy and relief. "You mean it? You're willing to do this?" "I mean it," Roy said. "But Helen, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Legal protections, proper funding, connections with law enforcement and the territorial government. We can't just wing it and hope for the best." Mrs. Thomas mentioned that her Women's Aid Society has experience with these things. She could help us set everything up properly. Roy nodded. "Then we'll talk to her tomorrow. But Helen, I need you to understand something. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. This ranch will become a target for men like Cox. People who profit from women's desperation. We'll be making enemies." Helen's expression grew fierce, and Roy saw in her the same steel that had carried her through her flight from Cox and the difficult birth of her son. "Let them come," she said. "We'll be ready for them." The transformation of Roy's ranch into a refuge began immediately. Donna Thomas proved to be a formidable ally, bringing not only experience but also connections to wealthy benefactors and sympathetic officials throughout the territory. Within a month, construction had begun on a series of small cabins that could house families temporarily while longer-term solutions were arranged. Dr. Jackson became the unofficial medical director of what they had begun calling Haven Ranch, providing care not just for the women who sought refuge, but for their children as well. His daughter, Christina Kelly, arrived from the territorial capital to help with the administrative work, her education and legal training proving invaluable in navigating the complex regulations surrounding their operation. Christina was a woman of 25 with her father's intelligence and her own fierce determination to right the wrongs that had nearly destroyed their family. She and Helen formed a close partnership, with Christina handling the legal and financial aspects of the refuge, while Helen managed the day-to-day care of the women and children who came seeking help. The first major test of their new mission came 6 weeks after Donna Thomas's initial visit. A woman named Sarah Mitchell arrived in the middle of the night, carrying a 3-year-old daughter and bearing injuries that made even Dr. Jackson's experienced hands shake with rage. Her husband, a prominent rancher from the next county, had beaten her unconscious when she tried to leave him, then tracked her across 200 miles of wilderness. "He'll come for me," Sarah whispered as Helen cleaned her wounds. "He has men, and he has money, and he doesn't believe in letting go of what he considers his property." Helen felt a familiar chill of fear, but it was tempered now by something stronger: righteous anger. She had seen too many women arrive at Haven Ranch bearing similar wounds, heard too many stories of men who believed they owned other human beings simply by virtue of marriage or blood relation. "Let him come," Helen said, echoing her words to Roy weeks earlier. "We're not the same defenseless women we were when we arrived here. We have friends now, and we have the Lee on our side." But even as she spoke the words, Helen knew that law and justice were not always the same thing, especially when dealing with wealthy men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and violence. Mitchell had resources that Cox had lacked, and he had the advantage of operating from a position of apparent respectability. The confrontation came 3 days later. Unlike Cox's theatrical approach with armed riders, Mitchell arrived with a small army of legitimate-looking men, including a sheriff from his home county and what appeared to be a federal marshal. They rode up to the ranch in broad daylight, their badges and official documents designed to intimidate through legal authority rather than raw force. Roy met them in the yard, flanked by Marshal Jeffrey Lee, who had taken a personal interest in protecting Haven Ranch after his success in prosecuting Cox. The two lawmen faced each other across the dusty ground, each representing different interpretations of justice and law. "Marshal Lee," the visiting sheriff said, his tone carefully respectful, "I'm Sheriff William Hayes from Millerville County. I'm here to collect a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who has unlawfully removed herself and her child from her husband's custody." "On what authority?" Lee asked. Though he already knew the answer would be complicated, Hayes produced a set of documents that looked disturbingly official. "Court order from Judge Harrison in Millerville, signed yesterday. Mrs. Mitchell is wanted for theft of property belonging to her husband, including the child and various household goods. The judge has ordered her return for trial." Roy felt his stomach sink. This was exactly the kind of legal manipulation that made their work so dangerous. A corrupt or intimidated judge could issue orders that gave the appearance of legitimacy to what amounted to kidnapping. "I'd like to see those documents," Christina Kelly said, stepping forward from where she had been standing near the house. Her legal training had taught her to look for the technical flaws that often existed in hastily prepared paperwork. Hayes looked surprised to be challenged by a woman, but he handed over the papers with obvious reluctance. Christina read them carefully, her expression growing more confident with each page. "These documents are invalid," she announced after several minutes of careful study. "The court that issued them has no jurisdiction over Mrs. Mitchell or her child, as they are both currently residents of this territory. Furthermore, the charges listed are civil matters that cannot be resolved through criminal warrants." Hayes's face reddened with anger. "Young lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you have no authority to challenge a legal court order." "Actually, I do," Christina replied calmly. "I'm a licensed attorney in this territory, and I'm representing Mrs. Mitchell in this matter. These documents are fraudulent, and attempting to enforce them constitutes kidnapping under territorial law." The standoff that followed was tense but brief. Mitchell himself, a large man with cold eyes and scarred knuckles, clearly wanted to resolve the matter through violence. But the presence of Marshal Lee and the legal challenge to his documents had undermined his position. After a heated conference with his men, he retreated with threats that everyone knew were not idle. "This isn't over," Mitchell snarled at Roy as he mounted his horse. "I know where she is now, and I know who's protecting her. You can't watch her every minute of every day." But Helen, who had been watching from the porch with Sarah and her daughter, stepped forward with a confidence that surprised even herself. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "you're right that you know where your wife is. She's in a place where she's surrounded by people who believe that no man has the right to beat a woman unconscious, where she has legal representation in the protection of territorial law, where her daughter can grow up without watching her mother being terrorized." She paused, shifting baby Thomas to her other arm as she continued. You can keep coming here, keep making threats, keep trying to use the law to drag her back. But every time you do, you'll face not just one frightened woman, but all of us, and we're not afraid of you anymore." Mitchell's face contorted with rage, but he seemed to recognize something in Helen's tone that gave him pause. This was not the cowering victim he had expected to find, but a woman who had found strength in community and purpose in protecting others. As Mitchell and his men rode away, Helen felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own life. The frightened refugee who had collapsed on Roy's porch 6 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who could stand up to dangerous men and mean every word she spoke. That evening, as the household settled into its new normal, Roy found Helen in the small office they had set up to manage the refuge's operations. She was writing letters to other women's aid societies, sharing information about resources and safe houses throughout the territory. "You were magnificent today, Siverson," Roy said, leaning into the chair across from her desk. Helen looked up from her writing, her face showing a mixture of satisfaction and lingering concern. "I meant what I said to Mitchell, but I also know he's not going to give up easily. Men like him never do." "No," Roy agreed, "but men like him also aren't used to facing organized opposition. They're accustomed to isolating their victims, making them feel helpless and alone. What we're building here changes that dynamic completely." Helen set down her pen and looked around the office, taking in the maps marking safe houses, the files documenting successful relocations, the correspondence with lawyers and judges who supported their cause. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is real," she said. "6 months ago, I was running through a storm with nowhere to go and no one to help me. Now look at all this." Roy followed her gaze, seeing not just the physical evidence of their work, but the larger transformation it represented. Haven Ranch had become something neither of them had imagined when Helen first arrived, a center of hope and resistance that was changing lives throughout the territory. "Helen," Roy said carefully, "there's something I need to ask you, something I've been thinking about for weeks." She looked at him with curiosity, noting the unusual formality in his tone. "This work we're doing, this refuge we've built, it's become the most important thing in my life. More important than the ranch, more important than my own safety or comfort. And a big part of that is because of what you've brought to it, the heart and soul you've given to this mission." Helen felt her pulse quicken, sensing that Roy was approaching something significant. "What I'm trying to say is that I can't imagine doing this work without you. Not just because you're good at it, though you are, but because you've become essential to who I am and what I want my life to mean." Roy stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the small cabins where women and children were sleeping safely for perhaps the first time in years. "Helen, I know that marriage might seem like the last thing you'd want after what you've been through. And I know that our situation is complicated, that people might see practical motives in what I'm asking. But I need you to know that what I feel for you has nothing to do with convenience or practicality." Helen's heart was racing now, but not with the fear that had defined so much of her recent life. This was different, a mixture of hope and possibility that she had never expected to feel again. "Roy," she said softly, "what exactly are you asking?" He turned back to face her, his weathered face showing a vulnerability that reminded her of the night he had first carried her into this house. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, not because you need protection or security, though I'll always provide both. Not because the refuge needs legitimacy, though marriage might help with that. I'm asking because I love you, Helen. I love your strength and your compassion and your absolute refusal to let the world's cruelty make you cruel in return." Helen stood slowly, her mind racing through the implications of Roy's proposal. Marriage had been a source of vulnerability in her previous life, a legal bond that had left her exposed to her husband's debts and Cox's predations. But she realized that her fear was based on her experience with Thomas, a good man, but a weak one who had been unable to protect either himself or his family from the harsh realities of frontier life. Roy was different. She had seen him face down armed men to protect her, had watched him risk his reputation and safety to build something meaningful from his grief and solitude. More importantly, she had seen him treat her as an equal partner in their work, never condescending or dismissive despite her youth and inexperience. Roy, she said, moving closer to where he stood by the window, when I was married to Thomas, I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming smaller and weaker every day, defined only by my relationship to him. When he died, I thought I had lost everything, but part of me also felt free for the first time in years. Roy's expression grew concerned, but Helen continued before he could speak. What you're offering feels different. When I think about being your wife, I don't imagine becoming smaller or weaker. I imagine becoming more myself, more capable of doing the work that matters to both of us. She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his years of hard work and harder choices. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the yard of Haven Ranch with all the women and children they had helped in attendance. Donna Thomas had insisted on organizing the celebration, turning it into both a personal milestone and a public statement about the legitimacy and permanence of their refuge. Dr. Jackson performed the ceremony, having been ordained for the purpose by a sympathetic minister in the territorial capital. Christina Kelly served as Helen's maid of honor, while Marshal Jeffrey Lee stood as Roy's best man. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. This marriage represented not just the union of two people, but the formal establishment of a community dedicated to protecting the vulnerable. Helen wore a simple white dress that Donna Thomas had commissioned from the finest seamstress in the territory, but she carried baby Thomas during the ceremony, a reminder that their family had been forged in crisis and strengthened by shared purpose. Roy wore his best suit, but he also wore his gun, a practical acknowledgement that their work would continue to attract dangerous enemies. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but revolutionary in substance. They promised not just to love and honor each other, but to continue their work together, to provide sanctuary for those who needed it, and to build something lasting from the ashes of their individual tragedies. As the celebration continued into the evening, Helen found herself standing apart from the crowd, watching the scene with a mixture of joy and amazement. The yard was filled with women and children who had found safety and hope at Haven Ranch, many of whom had gone on to build new lives elsewhere, but had returned for this special day. Judith Gomez was there with her new husband, a gentle man who had courted her patiently while she healed from her previous trauma. Deborah Peterson had given birth to a healthy daughter and was training to become a teacher, planning to open a school for the children of women seeking refuge. Sarah Mitchell had successfully divorced her abusive husband and was now working with Christina Kelly to help other women navigate the legal system. Each success story represented not just individual triumph, but validation of the work Helen and Roy had undertaken together. They had proven that it was possible to build something positive from pain, to create a sanctuary in a world that often seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. Roy appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist as they watched their guests dancing to music provided by a small group of musicians from town. "Any regrets?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Helen leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of his presence and the security that came from knowing she was no longer facing the world alone. "Only one," she said, smiling up at him. "I regret that it took a storm and a desperate flight through the night to bring us together. I wish we could have found each other under happier circumstances." Roy considered this, then shook his head. "I don't think we would have recognized each other under happier circumstances. We both needed to be broken down before we could be built back up into the people we were meant to be." As if summoned by their conversation, baby Thomas began to fuss in Helen's arms, demanding attention with the imperious cry that had become familiar to everyone at Haven Ranch. Helen adjusted his blanket and began the gentle swaying motion that usually soothed him, but tonight he seemed determined to make his presence known. "He's going to be a handful," Roy observed, reaching out to stroke the baby's soft hair. "He's going to be strong," Helen corrected. "Strong enough to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, just like his father would have been if he'd lived long enough." Roy felt a complex mixture of emotions at Helen's words. He had never tried to replace Thomas in baby Thomas's life, but he had come to love the child as his own. The boy would grow up knowing the truth about his parentage, but he would also know that family was about more than blood relations. The evening wound down gradually, with guests departing for various destinations throughout the territory. Some would return to their new lives in distant towns, while others would remain at Haven Ranch to help with the ongoing work of providing sanctuary and support. As Helen and Roy said their final goodbyes and settled into the quiet of their home, they found themselves in the kitchen where their relationship had truly begun. Helen remembered the night Roy had fed her stew and listened to her story, the first time in months that she had felt truly safe. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened the door that night?" Helen asked as she prepared to nurse Thomas before putting him to bed. Roy considered the question seriously. "I try not to think about it because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. You and Thomas might not have survived the storm. Cox might have found you before you found help. The refuge might never have existed." He paused, looking around the kitchen that had become the heart of their home and their mission. "But more than that, I might have spent the rest of my life as a bitter, lonely man who had given up on the possibility of love and purpose. You saved me as much as I saved you, Helen. Maybe more." Helen felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude that had become a constant presence in her life. She had learned that survival was not just about escaping danger, but about finding meaning in the aftermath of trauma. "Roy," she said, "I have something to tell you. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." Roy looked at her with concern, noting the serious tone in her voice. "I'm pregnant," Helen said simply. "About 2 months along, Dr. Jackson thinks." Roy's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to joy to concern, and back to joy again. He reached out and pulled Helen into his arms, careful not to disturb baby Thomas, who had finally settled into peaceful nursing. "Are you happy about it?" Helen asked, suddenly uncertain despite Roy's obvious joy. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Roy said, his voice thick with emotion. "But Helen, are you ready for this? Another child on top of everything else we're trying to do?" Helen looked down at Thomas, then around the kitchen that had become the center of so many lives, then back at Roy's weathered, honest face. "I think this baby is exactly what Haven Ranch needs," she said. "A symbol that our work isn't just about surviving trauma, but about building something beautiful and lasting from it." That night, as they settled into bed together as husband and wife for the first time, Helen reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been a desperate refugee with no hope and no future. Now she was a wife, a mother, a leader in a cause that was changing lives throughout the territory, and soon she would be a mother again. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, but Helen had learned that the most profound changes often came from the most desperate circumstances. She had been forced to discover strength she didn't know she possessed, courage she had never needed before, and love she had never expected to find again. Roy lay beside her, one hand resting protectively on her still flat belly, while the other held baby Thomas, who had insisted on sleeping between his parents on this special night. Helen watched the two most important people in her world and felt a peace that she had never known was possible. Outside, the wind that had once driven her through the storm in desperate flight now whispered gently through the trees around Haven Ranch, carrying with it the promise of new seasons and new beginnings. The refuge they had built would continue to grow and evolve, providing sanctuary for countless women and children who would arrive in the years to come. But tonight, Helen was content to simply exist in this moment of perfect happiness, surrounded by love and purpose and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her place in the world. The frightened young woman who had collapsed on Roy's porch was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more hopeful about what the future might bring. The years that followed Helen and Roy's wedding brought both challenges and triumphs to Haven Ranch. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah in honor of Sarah Mitchell, was born healthy and strong in the spring following their marriage. Dr. Jackson delivered the baby with the same skill and care he had shown with Thomas. But this birth was different, surrounded by joy and anticipation rather than fear and desperation. The refuge continued to grow, both in size and reputation. Word spread throughout the territory and beyond about the ranch where women could find safety and support, where children could grow up free from violence, and where new beginnings were not just possible but actively nurtured. Donna Thomas had helped them establish formal connections with similar organizations in other territories, creating a network of safe houses and supportive communities that spanned half the continent. Christina Kelly had married a young lawyer from the territorial capital, and together they had established a legal aid society that provided free representation to women seeking divorces or protection from abusive husbands. Their work had resulted in several important legal precedents that strengthened women's rights throughout the territory, including the landmark case that invalidated the kind of fraudulent custody orders that men like Mitchell had tried to use. But success brought new challenges. As Haven Ranch's reputation grew, so did the opposition from those who profited from women's vulnerability. They faced legal challenges from corrupt officials, economic pressure from businessmen who disapproved of their mission, and occasional direct threats from men whose wives or daughters had found refuge at the ranch. The most serious threat came in the third year of the refuge's operation, when a group of wealthy ranchers attempted to have Haven Ranch declared a public nuisance and shut down by territorial authorities. They argued that the concentration of undesirable women was corrupting local morals and encouraging wives to abandon their legal obligations to their husbands. The legal battle that followed lasted 8 months and required all of Christina's skill and connections to resolve. In the end, they prevailed not just through legal arguments, but through the testimony of dozens of women whose lives had been saved by the refuge's existence. The territorial governor himself visited Haven Ranch during the proceedings, and his public endorsement effectively ended the opposition's campaign. Helen found herself thrust into a public role she had never sought but came to embrace. She testified before territorial committees, spoke at women's gatherings throughout the region, and wrote articles for newspapers about the need for legal protections for vulnerable women and children. Her story, from desperate refugee to respected advocate, became a symbol of what was possible when society chose to support rather than abandon those in need. But even as their public work flourished, Helen and Roy never forgot the personal foundation that made everything else possible. Their family grew to include not just their biological children, but also several young people who had come to Haven Ranch as children and chosen to stay as they grew to adulthood. Thomas, now a sturdy 4-year-old, had become a big brother to Sarah and to several other children whose mothers had found refuge at the ranch. The boy showed signs of his father's gentle nature, but also his adoptive father's quiet strength. He was protective of the younger children and seemed to understand, even at his young age, that their home was special, a place where people came when they needed help and safety. One evening in late autumn, as Helen was putting the children to bed, Thomas asked her a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Mama," he said, using the name he had always called her, despite knowing that Roy was not his biological father. "Why do some papas hurt their families?" Helen sat down on the edge of his bed, considering how to answer such a profound question in terms a 4-year-old could understand. "Some people have hurt inside them," she said finally. "Hurt that makes them angry and scared, and sometimes they don't know how to make it better except by hurting other people. It's not right, and it's not the fault of the people they hurt, but it happens." Thomas considered this seriously, his young face creased with thought. "Is that why the ladies come here? Because their papas have hurt inside them?" "Sometimes," Helen agreed. "And when they come here, we help them feel safe again, and we help their children feel safe too. Like Papa Roy helped us feel safe?" Helen felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Exactly like that." Thomas nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. "When I grow up, I want to help people feel safe too." "I think you will," Helen said, kissing his forehead. "I think you'll be very good at it." As Helen left Thomas's room and moved on to check on Sarah, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib, she reflected on how much their lives had changed since that stormy night when she had collapsed on Roy's porch. The refuge they had built was important. The lives they had saved were meaningful, but perhaps the most significant achievement was the family they had created from the ashes of tragedy. She found Roy in his study, working on the accounts that kept Haven Ranch financially viable. The refuge operated on a combination of donations, territorial funding, and income from the ranch's agricultural operations, and managing the complex finances required constant attention. "How are we doing?" Helen asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Better than expected," Roy replied, looking up from his ledgers. "The territorial appropriation came through, and Donna Thomas has secured commitments from several wealthy donors in the capital. We should be able to expand the medical facility and add 2 more family cabins this spring. Helen nodded, pleased but not surprised. Haven Ranch's success in helping women build new lives had attracted support from unexpected quarters, including some of the territory's most prominent citizens. "Roy," she said, "Thomas asked me tonight why some fathers hurt their families. It got me thinking about something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Roy set down his pen and gave her his full attention. "What's that?" "I think it's time we started thinking about what comes next. Not just for the refuge, but for us personally. Thomas and Sarah are going to grow up here, surrounded by stories of trauma and recovery. I want to make sure they understand not just the darkness we're fighting against, but the light we're fighting for." Roy leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to start a school," Helen said, "not just for the children who come here with their mothers, but for all the children in the area. A place where they can learn not just reading and writing, but compassion and justice, and the belief that they can make a difference in the world." The idea was ambitious, requiring resources and approval that would take years to secure. But Roy could see the passion in Helen's eyes, the same determination that had driven her to transform herself from victim to advocate. "It would be a big undertaking, Bert," he said carefully. "We'd need teachers, buildings, books, approval from the Territorial Education Department." "I know," Helen said. "But Roy, imagine what we could accomplish if we could reach children before they learn that cruelty is normal, before they accept that some people are worth less than others. Imagine if we could teach them from the beginning that everyone deserves safety and respect and the chance to build a good life." Roy stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the small community they had built around the original ranch house. Lights glowed in the windows of the family cabins, and he could see people moving about their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that they were safe and valued. "You know what I think?" he said, turning back to Helen. "I think that 4 years ago, a desperate young woman collapsed on my porch in the middle of a storm. I thought I was saving her life, but it turned out she was saving mine. And now she's proposing to save a whole generation of children." Helen felt tears prick her eyes at the emotion in Roy's voice. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Roy said, moving to pull her into his arms. "But Helen, if we're going to do this, if we're going to take on education as well as refuge work, we need to be prepared for even more opposition. There are people who don't want children, especially girls, to be educated at all, much less educated to think critically about justice and equality." "Let them oppose us," Helen said, echoing words she had spoken years earlier in very different circumstances. "We've faced worse enemies and survived. We can face this too." That night, as Helen and Roy lay in bed planning their expanded mission, they could hear the sounds of their community settling into sleep around them. Children's laughter drifted from the family cabins, women's voices murmured gentle goodnights, and the wind carried the scent of cooking fires and fresh hay from the barn. It was the sound of safety, of home, of people who had found sanctuary and were building new lives from the pieces of their shattered old ones. It was everything Helen had dreamed of during those dark nights when she had run through the storm with nowhere to go and no one to help her. But more than that, it was the foundation for something even greater. The school Helen envisioned would teach future generations that the world could be different, that cruelty was not inevitable, that every person had value and potential regardless of their circumstances. As Helen drifted off to sleep, she thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived at this ranch, broken and desperate and convinced that her life was over. That woman could never have imagined the life she now lived, the work she now did, the love she now knew was possible even after the deepest trauma. The transformation had not been easy or quick. There had been setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the weight of other people's pain had threatened to crush her own healing spirit. But she had learned that healing was not a destination, but a journey, not something that happened to you, but something you chose to pursue every day. And she had learned that the most profound healing came not from forgetting the past, but from using it to build something better for the future. Every woman who found safety at Haven Ranch, every child who grew up free from violence, every student who would someday attend their school was a testament to the possibility of redemption and renewal. The storm that had driven Helen to Roy's door had been the worst night of her life, But it had also been the beginning of everything good that followed. She had learned to see storms not as disasters to be endured, but as forces of change that could clear away what was broken and make room for what was meant to grow. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees around Haven Ranch, carrying with it the promise of new seasons and new possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve those who needed help. But tonight, Helen Morgan slept peacefully in the arms of the man who had carried her to safety and helped her discover that she was strong enough to carry others. In the morning, there would be work to do, plans to make, and dreams to pursue. There would be a school to build, and children to teach, and women to protect. There would be the ongoing mission of proving that sanctuary was possible, that healing was real, and that love could triumph over the darkest circumstances. But for now, there was simply this, the quiet contentment of a woman who had found her purpose, the deep satisfaction of a life lived in service to something greater than herself, and the unshakable knowledge that no storm could ever again leave her without shelter, without hope, or without the strength to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. The refuge they had built would continue long after they were gone, a testament to the truth that one person's courage to help another could ripple outward through generations, creating waves of healing and hope that would touch countless lives yet to come. And it had all begun with a simple choice: to open a door to someone in need, to carry her to safety, and to whisper the words that every frightened soul needs to hear: "You're safe now."